This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. With me is John Watson, a teacher at Mulrennan Middle School. John, tell me a little bit about your role at Mulrennan.
Thank you, Dr. Fine. Basically, I serve as a teacher and also the subject area leader, which means the department head of social studies there at Mulrennan, and teach students and also help teachers with their lessons and with their classes as well.
Great. The conversation today focuses on separation of powers and the system of checks and balances. John, I'm sure you have lots of questions for me. What's your first one?
Okay, good. I do. Because of our government being set up the way it is and there have been limitations placed upon our government, can we draw direct connections between the limitations that are placed upon our government and the complaints that were found in the Declaration of Independence?
That's a great question. You know, it's interesting because when we look at our current Constitution, we have to understand that it wasn't as if people just sat down and wrote it without any experience or ideas or thoughts. They just sort of sat down and it came out. It didn't happen that way at all. And in fact, what your question is about is sort of what is fundamental to the Constitution. And indeed, there are sort of two sets of limits found in the Constitution that are not the same. Separation of powers and checks and balances are not the same. Separation of powers means that the legislative power, the executive power, and the judiciary power will function independently from one another. But at the same time, the framers understood that one could still abuse their power even if they had one power, so the power to legislate or the power to make laws. So checks and balances says that every branch also functions so that at least one other branch, if not both, has a check or can have an impact on what that branch actually does. Now, you asked me sort of where did that come from? Well, if we go back to the Declaration of Independence, we can see that many of the complaints of the colonists were that the king was refusing to allow the other powers of government to function as separate powers. So, for example, the colonists said that the king has refused to allow for the administration of justice. They said that the king made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. I think that's a direct quote, because I think I was there. But in any case, right, so basically it says, well, how could a justice make an independent judgment? If the king doesn't like it, the king could take away his payment, could fire him, could do those kinds of things. Well, what do we see in the U.S. Constitution? Not only is there an independent judiciary branch, but we see that for the U.S. Supreme Court, how long do they serve? For life. Okay, right? They serve for life with good behavior, so they have to be well behaved. And at the same time, their salaries cannot be changed while they're in offices. So we see, even in terms of the U.S. Supreme Court, members serve for life, so therefore their tenure of their offices is not an issue. And their salaries are not an issue either, because right in the Constitution it says you cannot reduce the salary of a justice.
Right, that's pretty good. So there are some practical reasons that actually were laid out in the Constitution, and it functions very well with our government.
Right. They even said that the king wouldn't allow the legislature to make laws. Right. So indeed, the fact that there were these complaints set out that we then would later see 11 years later with the writing of the Constitution, that those complaints would see their way into becoming structures of government.
Right, and that's pretty good. And those structures do limit the power, and that's pretty good because we don't see much abuse. But here's my question. With the limitations, do the limitations actually get in the way of government doing its job? Do you see that happening?
You know, a lot of people say that, and I think it depends on where you are on the ideological or party spectrum as to whether or not you would say yes or no. So I will say that people do believe, for example, that the president cannot declare war. Yet the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So people say, well, how can the president function as commander-in-chief of the armed forces if he cannot declare war? Because did you know, John, that not only is the declaration of war something that is a power of Congress, did you know it cannot be vetoed? Right? It's not a law.
Yeah. It's true.
So Congress can decide whether or not the nation's going to go to war. The president has no say in it, and yet the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Yet, if the president wants to go to war, he can't, even though he's commander-in-chief of the armed forces.
So what happens if Congress decides to declare war, but the president says, I'm not going to execute the war? What happens then?
Well, you know, at that point, we're sort of in a little bit of trouble, right? Because the president is commander-in-chief. And certainly we've seen instances in our history, even in 20th century history, where even though the president was commander-in-chief, he has refused to abide by his constitutional obligations. So for example, even if we go back to 1955, which really wasn't that long ago, in 1955, the United States Supreme Court, in a second Brown versus Board of Education case, had to instruct the president to move ahead, quote, with all deliberate speed, because President Eisenhower was refusing to enforce the court's decision in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, to desegregate the schools, right? So yes, we do have a constitutional crisis. If Congress decides that the president should do something, or if the courts decide that the president or the state government should do something, and they don't, because the Congress also cannot remove the president either.
Right, so that's an issue then. Well, I mean, with the different checks and balances that we do have, do you find that one particular branch has the ace card over the other branches? I mean, it's not supposed to be that way, but practically speaking.
You know, yes, the legislative branch has, I like the ACE card, right? Because it helps us remember. You know, oftentimes people say, how do you remember things? How do people remember things? Well, you said ACE card, right? Well, the letter A is the first letter of the alphabet, and the legislature is the first branch of government in the U.S. Constitution. Exactly. So that's a great way to remember. The legislature has the ACE card. It's number one. The legislative branch is the most powerful of the three branches of government for a couple of reasons. One is that you cannot enforce or adjudicate a law that doesn't exist. So if Congress doesn't pass a law, then there's nothing to adjudicate, nothing to enforce. Even if we look at the Constitution itself, what we find is there are 7 articles in the U.S. Constitution. The longest of the 7 is the ACE card, is number 1, is the legislative branch. So it's first, it's longest, and we understand that the other 2 branches of government have to work based on what the legislature does. You can't enforce or adjudicate a law that doesn't exist, and you must enforce and you must adjudicate laws, as the Supreme Court was saying in Brown versus Board 1955. You must enforce laws that do exist.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And so with the third article talking about the judicial branch, does that then mean that they're the weaker? I mean, that's kind of...
You know, it was the founders' intent. It was the founders' intent that the judiciary branch would be the least powerful branch. And we see not only is it the shortest of the 3 branches, if you're looking at that, but we also see that it's written with the least amount of detail. It says there should be 1 Supreme Court and all other courts that Congress shall create and establish. It says that it doesn't say how many members of the Supreme Court there shall be. There shall be 1 Supreme Court. We have 9, but it's not because the Constitution says we have 9. It says that they can serve not only without being elected, but they can also serve for life with good behavior. Now, you know, an interesting irony, and then I'll go back to what I was saying. You know who decides what good behavior is, John? Congress. Yeah. They have to somehow come to an agreement about what bad behavior is in order to remove someone, which is why no one's been removed from the Supreme Court ever. You can't come to agreement on that. But let's get back to our conversation. You know, when we're looking at sort of the Supreme Court, many people believe that the Supreme Court was given in the Constitution the power of judicial review. And so they say, well, how could you have a Supreme Court, life terms, no set number of judges, no set number of courts, and give them the power of judicial review, which is to say that a law is unconstitutional. That's because it's not in the Constitution. Judicial review came later in the 1803 decision of Marbury versus Madison.
And thus putting the Supreme Court on the stage as an equal branch, almost, supposedly anyway. But over the course of our history, we have had these struggles. Which one is exercising its power and which one is not.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that over the course of U.S. history that the balance has been pretty much set, that has actually been balanced, our government, our three branches have been balanced over that course?
Yes, John, absolutely. One of the things that, of course, the founders could not anticipate was everything that was going to happen over the next 200 plus years. So what we have found, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, is that the president wants more power that Congress doesn't want to give him, or the president believes he should have more power, whether or not Congress has given it to him, or the courts even. And so we see, for example, that there have been some limitations placed on that relationship. For example, in the 22nd Amendment, which was ratified in 1951, the president was given term limits being 2-term presidency, 2 4-year terms max, unless, of course, if the president becomes president because of the death or resignation of a president and this person was vice president. Right. Therefore, that person can serve up to 2 years of another term and then 2 full terms. So it's really 10 years, but it's 2 full terms plus up to 2 if you come into the presidency that way. So we know that the relationship between the president and Congress is going to be very different in the first term than in the second term, because you know under every circumstance the second is the last. Right. You don't know if the first is the only, but you certainly know that the second is the last. So we've seen that, why are there limits placed on the president in the middle of the 20th century? Because of the wars, because World War I, World War II, the presidents wanted to have more power than they actually were given by Congress.
Right. And do you think that giving the president a little more power would have helped us with some of these actions, some of these wars and things?
That's a really interesting question, because you can look at the Congress, 535 people. Somehow they have to come together and make a decision and make it work, right? Because the Congress, of course, has the power of authorization as well as the power of appropriation. They not only say what the government can do, but they have to pay for it, right? But at the same time, if the president who's elected believes that he should act alone, then it can create a lot of conflict. We saw those conflicts come up with Vietnam. More recently, we've seen conflicts between the president and Congress relative to the war in Iraq. Right. We've seen these conflicts come up because Congress says, wait a second, we are elected to represent the people. We are the voice of the people. And the president says, no, but I can't wait for you to come together, all 535 of you, right? 435, of course, in the House and 100 in the Senate, to come together and make up your minds. We don't have time for that. I need to act alone. And we've seen, for example, that the War Powers Resolution was written to try to get at some of that tension, that the War Powers Resolution essentially says that the president can act alone in an emergency, but he also has to seek congressional approval after his actions in order to make sure that Congress is behind him. If Congress isn't behind him, then the president has to resolve the action within 60 days or 90 days, depending on the circumstances of the action. So we really have seen how what the founders wanted, which was separation of powers with some checks and balances, has had to be refined over the years because we've had different events happening. We've had different personalities in the president's office. We've had different personalities in Congress, and even different personalities in the Supreme Court in terms of their view about how the relationship should be between the president, Congress, and the Supreme Court. John, I'm sorry to tell you that we are out of time on this very interesting conversation. We've been talking about separation of powers and the system of checks and balances. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine.